So you're saying don't fix the whole problem right away? What part of the problem exists that we can fix?
That's right. Identify what the greatest barriers are. So you have some resources. You have Lutheran Social Services, and you have the link, and you have others, and they can come to the table, and you begin to identify, well, in the high schools we see this, or in the community colleges we see this, or out on the streets we see this. What are the interventions that are going to be key, and then how do we get resources to fill that? And think of this as kind of a spectrum of resources, not a continuum, because kids don't have to go from drop-in center to shelter to housing. Some kids can go directly to housing. Some kids can go directly back to family if you have counseling. Some kids just need short-term help. Some kids need 5 years of help. But so you need to think about this as a smorgasbord. You have none of it hardly here right now. Does that make sense? You don't have much on your plate. So the question is how over time, over the next frankly 20 years, are you going to start to fill in that smorgasbord with these different interventions that work with different youth? It's very daunting, I realize, and I'm not trying to be negative, but you have to think about where do you start from, and right now you really don't have a sense of what's the priority population we want to key in on, build from that. Like you said, the shelter could be something you could build from, I agree, but you're really then focused on a particular age group, and it seems to me that if you did a better outreach model, and I'm not talking about street outreach, I'm talking about community outreach, going into the schools, going into centers, going into the juvenile detention center, and working with foster care. Because in my opinion, every homeless youth is a neglected and abused child in America and is entitled to services by the state, but frankly, they don't get into child welfare very easily as 17 or 16-year-olds. They just don't. Because people don't want them in their homes and stuff. But that's where legal advocacy comes into. Then you start to say, okay, that's the barrier. I need an attorney to represent this kid because the county's not taking the case. So the attorney's going to take this case on a pro bono basis. We're going to do a delegation of parental authority. We're going to do some kind of petition in court. You know, there's different solutions, you see. So I'm just trying to say you need to identify it better.
Okay, so if the continuum of care is now convening a committee that's focused on youth, that would potentially be a good place to start.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
And you could use some of this money to hire case managers to go out into the communities to document where are the resources and where are the gaps. Does it make sense? And use that information after a year or two to get more money to go to Tom in his programs and HUD and say, okay, now we know that the first thing we want to do is a transitional housing program for kids, or we want to do an emergency shelter for younger kids, or whatever it is. But until you do a better, in what I call environmental scan, what's happening here and how do I start to address this, I think you're going to be, you're going to do a really good work finding a shelter, but the question is that really what you need? And I think you're just guessing at this point in time. Not that there's probably not a need.
I know that at one of the continuum of care meetings, they have done some, tried to do some counting of homeless youth in the area, and it's been very unsuccessful.
I mean, I think we know we need that, but that's just one, like you're
Right.
saying, that's just one piece of what we need. I mean, what you're saying does make sense. It's just not one nice, tangible outcome.
Yeah, and that's, I think.
So nice to have one
yeah.
nice, you know, here's what we, I mean,
Right.
I get that too.
Yeah, and I think that's why LGR picked homeless youth, is to get to this point where we can know where to start. I mean, not to put LGR down, we don't know anything about homeless youth. You know, that's why we did this project, to learn about it and get all of these people who can do something and who work in it every day. And we just are finding a place to start, I guess.
Right.
And that's kind of what our goal is too. So
I think we can all say right from the start, most people you talk to, I mean, these dinners, you sit there and people come in and every one of them will tell you, just like we could tell you, we didn't know this problem really existed.
Right.
And, you know, unfortunately, maybe that's what we're gonna walk away from, is saying now people understand the problem exists. And that might be, at this point, you know, it's a big start, you know, but, you know, we do sit here and say, now we've raised a bunch of money, and, you know, is it gonna be fair to people who've given us the money to say, now we're gonna spend it on trying to identify who the kids are and whatever, because we've said we're gonna apply this to youth homelessness, you know, so.
But maybe it's packaged like it's a case manager to further, you know, that it's not like necessarily more research or more data gathering. I mean, that's essentially what you're doing, but it's also.
it's still going for the cause.
Right, it's going towards the cause, I mean, that's gonna have to.
And you could turn the house into a community outreach center and drop-in center to collect data and to be the focal point for
Be the
community
focus.
gatherings. Does it make sense to try to identify this and system reform issues better? You could use the space at first just to do that, and then you could build into that apartments later. Does it make sense once you've identified it? You could start to use the structure, in other words.
So now, does it make sense for this to be a house in the middle of the community, or would it make a lot more sense in that situation for it to be a building downtown that has space in it? Because to me, a house at that point doesn't seem like the best way to do it.
No, you need to take the drop-in center to where people can easily drop
Access,
in.
yeah.
And so, I mean, is anybody here from the Salvation Army?
There is somebody at this forum, but I don't think they're in this room.
Well, I know Cindy Norgard's here, I
Yeah.
wondered if there were any other people here, but, I mean, they certainly have places downtown for people. Is anybody here from RCTC, before I insult anyone? I work with RCTC a lot, it is a wonderful, University Center is terrific, but I was told, when I brought up the idea of maybe having a resource room at the college, that they only had 2 homeless students. And, to me, that's a huge education kind of thing on its own, and, so anyway, I do think that's a separate issue, I know, but it's still in my head. But I do think having a drop-in center, is the easiest place to start collecting data, and you need to have it where it's accessible to kids.
I'm gonna throw out a few random ideas, and again, I'm a housing developer. The first thing I wanna say is I wish I could talk as good as Rich does.
Yeah.
He's
I
really
think we
got
all
it
want
together,
it.
but I think I can dovetail off with some of what he said, and my stuff again is gonna be very random. The first thing is whatever you do, you need to do in a planful way. And you need to take the time to figure it out. And it needs to be under this big umbrella that you talked about. Otherwise, somebody's gonna offer you a used car and you're gonna say, yeah, and we know a couple kids that will start a program that can use this used car. And maybe that's not a good example, but you need to do whatever you do in a planful way. Secondly, there are some other resources in terms of demographics. Wilder Foundation in particular does some work, and I'll tell you real quickly, we enlisted them to do a study for us about families with the highest housing needs in Duluth. They charged us only $2,500, and it was some of the best money that we spent. And quite honestly, it legitimizes anything. When we go to Tom, we say, Wilder said, and we hand them this document, and it legitimizes it.
And Wilder does a lot in the homeless area. They run the homeless management information system, they do a triennial count separate from POD. So I think that's a great idea. They have a lot of credibility.
Third, I'm gonna go right back to where you started. First of all, I've got to commend all you students for what you did. This is incredible. Just by hearing what you said at the start was something, but that you've got the insight to say, how are we gonna carry this forward is really insightful, and I think that's really good. And I think, that again dovetails on what Rich says. I think if you do it in a planful way, you need somebody that's gonna carry this plan forward, and it's not 6 months or it's a year, it's gonna be a long time. I think it's ironic that Tom showed the picture of Errol, of the house, the youth warrior program in Virginia as an example of a good program here. Because one of the messages I'd send you is housing development, and we're in here to talk about shelter and housing, is not for the faint of heart. Arrowhead Economic Development had to sue the city of Virginia to get a building permit. That took 3 years and a lot of blood, sweat, and tears and a lot of heartburn to make that program happen. So if an organization of some sort is gonna make a commitment to doing something like this, no matter what it ends up looking like, you gotta be ready for that, because it is really difficult. And it's I guess I use the word long incubation period. Any project you do, if you're gonna do it really well, you gotta give it the time to incubate and build it. I'll also say it's ironic that Tammy's sitting in the room here. I called one of her bosses earlier today on my way down here. Rod Brown is one of the vice presidents at LSS. He and I have gotten to be friends over the last 6 months or so, and we're talking about doing a collaboration. It so happens that we're talking about doing one in Duluth, but collaborations are really, really important. And an organization like LSS that's been around for 100 years?
147.
147 years, probably knows something.
Did Rod tell you to test me?
But, you know, they've got a long track record, and they know how to do development, and they know services. So when you're buddying up, look to build on organizations that have strength, and I think